Great.
Thank you. So good morning, good afternoon, and good night, everyone. Today's our first guest speaker series. We have with us today Lauren. I don't know how you pronounce your name. Cuscuna?
Cuscuna, yeah, that's correct.
Cuscuna, okay. So from Safe Water Network, we'll have a series of talks similar to this in the next once a month for the remaining of the year. And we've sort of identified throughout the months that program evaluation or impact measurement is a big question, not only for us, but for other organizations. I reached out to Lauren, I don't know, a couple months back, maybe, Lauren, and we had a conversation about impact measurement. And so I invited her to share a little bit of what another water nonprofit organization is doing. So Lauren, to you. You can introduce yourself a bit better than I did. Go ahead.
Sure, I will. So yeah, my name is Lauren Cuscuna. I work for Safe Water Network. I'm the Senior Manager of Innovations and Monitoring, Evaluation, and Learning. So a lot of what I do is working with both our funders and the program teams to develop programs and what the metrics are that we're going to be measuring, what are resources we need, and how we're going to evaluate performance. And then after we implement the programs, I'll be a part of that performance analysis and then capture those findings into publications, internal reports, and events. And then I also manage a lot of the relationships with our institutional donors as well. So really just serving between a liaison between the experts in the field and then our donors and the New York office and our headquarters. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. Everyone can see that?
Yeah, you see it, perfect.
Okay, so this is measuring impact in wash projects.
Sorry, we see the, what is it called? The other format. We see the
presenter view,
presenter slide.
Oh,
which is no big deal, but just wanted to.
let me see. Oh, I think, I'm not sure why that is.
By something related to which screen you're sharing. Anyone here know how to do the trick? Do you have two screens?
Is that better? Yeah, I took the second screen off, so.
There you go, perfect.
Okay. All right, so for this presentation, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Safe Water Network and then tell you about our process for impact evaluation and then how we use that data and we make it meaningful for the work that we do. And then I'm also going to give you an overview of a project which we started last spring, which was to look at how the sector was measuring social impact specifically and how they see social impact. And that's an ongoing project that Green Empowerment is now part of the workshops in the second phase of that. I also have my email here. I know we'll have time for questions after the presentation, but if at any point you wanted to shoot me an email later on and had a question, then feel free to do that. So one of the ways that we create impact at Safe Water Network is through field implementation. And we operate over 400 stations across Ghana and India. This reaches over 1.6 million people to give them access to safe water. And we provide this water at an affordable price. So our customers make between $1 and $2.50 a day. And the price of water is less than 3 to 5% of their overall income. We have two different models in Ghana and India. So in India, we use a social enterprise model. We have social entrepreneurs, which opt in and they own and manage the stations. We also work with women's groups who do similar activities. And then in Ghana, It's more of a micro utility model where we have contracts with 9 out of the 16 district assemblies. We build the stations and the communities own the stations, and we manage and operate them for 15 to 20 years until it's completely transferred over to the community. And in both countries, we make sure that we source water sustainably. We also make sure that we have the relationships with communities and local governments so that we have community buy-in. We do many community engagement activities and education on hygiene and the benefits of water. We also hire locally and train locally for the staff at our stations. And we create custom water safety plans for each station, depending on the contaminants that are in those areas and the needs of that community. So we've also set up in both countries field service teams. So these tend to be teams that are located in a city and that travel regularly, at least once a week, out to their stations. And these field service teams provide preventative maintenance, but they're also really the overall managers of the station. So they're in charge of the marketing, the education, the community engagement, and any information, any problems that crop up, they're the ones who react to that and who communicate what they need so that we can get it to them as well. And our model also integrates a few different financial mechanisms that are built for sustainability. So one is contributions towards an asset renewal fund that stations pay into. And these are designed so that in the long term, they'll be able to replace the parts that they need. We also have a mechanism built in so that after the first year of operation, entrepreneurs or communities can start to receive some of that revenue that they're getting from water sales and either take it for themselves if it's an entrepreneur or back into the community in that case. And then we also have a dedication to innovations. So we're always piloting new approaches or different types of technologies. This could be anything from a water ATM to prepaid meters to chillers, which were very popular in India. That came out of an idea of one entrepreneur who knew people liked cold water. So he started putting chillers at his station, and now we've scaled it across India, and we're going to scale it across Ghana as well. So in addition to field implementation, there are two other workflows we have that are alternative pathways to achieving impact. So one of those is technical advisory, where we work with governments and implementers to provide training and capacity building. And the other is sector engagement, and this includes activities that create an enabling environment like policy advisory or producing evidence-based reports that can influence policy, or it's activities that promote collaboration among sector stakeholders. So in both countries, we have alliances with different implementers, and we meet regularly on different topics. Why is measuring impact important? At Safe Water Network, we see 3 key reasons on how to use data and why it's important for our organization. So one is that it allows us to learn more about our operations and what our customers need, and we can use this to change our strategy and to improve our service delivery. I always say that, a lot of times in wealthier countries where people are using mobile phones more often, where they're using the internet more often, they have an advantage because they're producing so much data and are able to communicate their wants and needs so much more easily. Whereas the less opportunity you have for that, the harder it is to have a voice as a consumer. So it's really important with the data that we have to be able to use it and really read into it and take it seriously. We also find that data and impact measurement has opened us up to different financing mechanisms, especially innovative finance for loans and results-based financing, and also government subsidies as well. And then impact measurement can also be used to benchmark with other implementers. So that's something we've also been working toward, is finding out what others are doing and trying to create alignment between how we measure impact and how we communicate that impact. And so, water is a very unique unique area to be looking at impact because it does have an effect on all other areas of life, education, health, work, things like that. And some would even say that it's a prerequisite for achieving impact in those other areas. But at the same time, this is also the reason why measuring impact in water can be very challenging, because it's difficult to show causation between those different impact areas, and it can be very costly and resource heavy. And so this leads a lot of implementers to struggle with how to best use their resources for measuring impact. So going into our process, what we like to do is play to our strengths. So we are not an academic or research institution, and we don't feel that we should be spending our resources on trying to show causation or trying to do big research projects, because there are other organizations that specialize in that have the resources and the funding to do that. And we also can rely on those resources to inform our strategy as well. So what we do have, the advantages that we do have as implementers is that we have a dedicated training, we have a dedicated field team, and we can invest in this field team to create protocols for collecting and reviewing data. We can invest in technology to try to make this more efficient, to try to collect more data points. And so we can really build up this core impact reporting system that we'll have on a regular basis, and that we can essentially be having years of historical data collecting on that. And then another advantage that implementers have is that they work very closely with the communities and customers. So they have great relationships with them. There's a lot of trust there. And this gives them really exclusive access to get opinions or complaints or subjective accounts on how this is affecting people's lives. And then lastly, we're able to then take that data and that information and react very quickly. So, if an implementer hears a complaint about something and wants to try something different, it would be very easy to sort of shift or test something out and see what kind of information, what kind of feedback we can get back from that. So overall, this is sort of what frames our data-driven strategy, is that we have regular, robust core impact reporting. When there are areas of interest or questions arise, then we look at thematic impact reporting, and these two things together are always going to be what informs our strategy. So one example of that is several years ago, we decided to put water ATMs at our stations. And we went into this project thinking this was a great innovation. It was going to increase our collection efficiency to 100%. It was going to allow customers to purchase water whenever they want. And it would also make it so that customers and vendors didn't have to travel with money, and customers could do financial planning as well. If they had an inconsistent income, they could put a lot of money on their card and use it for water later. So we piloted this at a few stations. And what we saw from just collecting the regular data from the meters is that collection efficiency did increase to 100%, but our volumes dropped and so did our revenues. So that meant that it wasn't just an issue of, people are spending the same money, but they're not getting as much because of the collection efficiency, but that people were actually moving away from purchasing at the stations. And so what we did is we sent the field team in to do surveys. They asked questions of customers and then reported them back to us. And what we found was that there was a lot of distrust of new technology. And in particular, a lot of customers felt that they would put the right amount of money on their card, but they wouldn't be getting the amount that they were promised. So we did about 20 liters per 2 US cents, and they believe that they weren't getting the full 20 liters for that. Some of our customers also really struggled with the mobile money, and a lot of them preferred buying water from vendors because vendors were members of the community. It was a source of income for them. And in certain cases, vendors even provided their own land for a community standpipe that they could operate. So what we did is we took this information and it shaped the strategy that we now have around implementing water ATMs. So we start very early on with doing training and education in communities to get people used to these machines, to make sure that they are on board, that they understand the benefits of it. We also, when we go into a station, an existing station, and do ATMs, we look for new sources of revenue for vendors. So one of these can be cleaning the stations, because if it's self-operated, then sometimes they require more cleaning. Also, in a lot of these existing stations, people still want to buy from vendors. They don't want to use a card. They don't want to use mobile money. So in that case, the vendors can still be there with their card, and we still pay them a 20% commission on what they sell. And another thing that we realized, seeing that there can be these negative effects to installing new technology at stations, is that it only really makes sense to be putting these ATMs at stations with high under collection. And this is existing stations. If we build new stations with ATM, it goes seamlessly. People don't have a problem with it. But in terms of the cost of the machine and the potential negative impacts that it can have on a community, if there's a community that's doing really well, they're selling lots of water, people are confident in the service, they're really happy with it, then it doesn't make sense to disrupt that flow and put an ATM in there, and it won't necessarily give you the financial return that we might have thought of earlier. So our core impact reporting is collected as part of our regular operations. Some of it is done digitally through water ATMs, piped connections. We have remote monitoring sensors in India. Our mobile money providers also give us some data on revenue. And then some of it is also collected manually. In Ghana, especially, we still have a lot of our data points collected manually, such as uptime, some meter readings, water quality data is all collected manually. And then this is reviewed in a two-step process. So we have the field service teams in both countries, and we'll have at least 2 reviewers of all the data points. And across Ghana and India, there's about 200 data points that we collect on a regular basis. So some examples could be around access, the number of stations or piped connections. We would also include education campaigns in here. Financial data, that's the revenue and expenses of the stations, but also what they can contribute toward the field team or the asset renewal. Operational data such as uptime, data on our innovations, the technologies that we're adding at stations, and then water quality data as well. One of the things that is definitely a big learning for us around core impact data collection and evaluation is that technology in and of itself does not necessarily create efficiency. And sometimes even it can create inefficiencies if it's not implemented right. So another project that we had done years ago around the same time that we were putting ATMs at stations was we wanted to start to invest in digital technologies. And we made the assumption that by doing this, we would be able to collect even more data points. And because it would be captured digitally, it would make it much more efficient for us to be collecting that data and then also accessing it for analysis. And what ended up happening, which is the case for many nonprofits or social entrepreneurs and enterprises, is that you have to use different vendors for different types of technologies, right? There's one vendor for a water ATM, one for a prepaid meter, one for your data management system. And what ends up happening is that none of these systems are integrated. And so there's a lot of manual integration that goes on. And even on the analysis side, you have to be pulling different spreadsheets and combining them in this way. And so really the process for collecting and reviewing data and doing the analysis became very cumbersome in our Ghana office. And our field service team was spending 40% of their time on data review, we had about 70% of data points that were coming in required a review. They required some kind of adjustment from the field team. And this would be, a back and forth phone calls, sometimes visits, going over receipts, things like that. So very time consuming. And what we did about a year and a half ago, we invested in a project to develop our own integrated digital operating platform. And so we worked with our vendors. We were able to create open APIs in order to combine all of this data and have it in one database. And this definitely helped with the time spent on data. It reduced the amount of time that officers were spending on data review by 50%. Now, as we were building this, we realized, from our past experience that creating good technology and using it right is all about modeling it after workflow and using human-centered design. So how can we actually use this technology to continue to reduce the work that the officers do and automate some of that, day-to-day tasks so that they can focus more of their time on community engagement and water quality. And what we did was we built in automated data validation, an automated data validation system, reminders and alerts. So what this does is that a lot of the data points that normally require review, we can set certain boundaries or rules to them. So if the chlorine residual is below a certain point, they'll get an alert and it'll say, are you sure this is correct? And they can review it. If it still works, then they can say yes, and it'll be flagged. So the officer knows to specifically look at that data point. And what this has done is it's made it so that in the past, as I said, 70% of the data that came in required adjustments, and now that number is 7%. So it's greatly increased our accuracy and reduced the work for these officers who, again, play such an important role that they can now focus on other activities around the station. And this is a quote from one of our station operators on the benefit that he saw to using this new digital operating platform. So he said, it's much easier now to get information to my supervisor without long phone calls and constant visits. I input my data every day and he approves it. No more shouting numbers over the phone. So it's been nice to see that it's had an impact, that both our operators and our officers can see. Okay, and then, as part of that core reporting, there's also regular analysis that we do on a quarterly or annual basis. So some examples of these include 5-year projections and financial modeling. We look at the customer value and the lifetime value of community standpipe and piped connection customers. So that allows us to see how the behavior is different, if they're spending more, if they put more on the card, more upfront money on the card, or if they do fewer value amounts with more frequency. We also look at the performance by volume tiers and ownership models. We do a sustainability gap analysis, which allows us to look at the true costs of delivering water, and then also what can be covered by revenue and what is the subsidy that needs to be gotten somewhere else, whether it's through governments or grant funders. We look at the inflow and outflow of asset renewal and year-on-year performance analysis of different operational and financial metrics. And then thematic impact collection can be useful in a couple different ways. So sometimes it's grant specific. If you have a grant, they might be specifically interested in, how household connections are going to impact usage. And then that's something that a study that we need to build and we need to fit into our program. Other times it happens when we have questions internally, when we're looking at changes in the data, or maybe we hear about a new innovation and we wonder whether or not it makes sense for us or what kind of impact it's going to have on us. It's also an opportunity to gather subjective accounts, which, going back to sort of our role and impact evaluation as compared to a research institution is so important, because for our operations, it really does come down to how the customer views our program. And we may know that, water can have these benefits, but if people don't necessarily view it that way, then the stations won't be sustainable. And then Another use for thematic impact is also for slow changes. So things that aren't necessarily changing day to day, even year to year. It can be something that's changing every couple years. One example of this that we've been talking about recently is how do we measure the impact of our policy work? So it might be the case where you want a wash regulatory agency to recognize that small water enterprises have a role in certain areas, or that pricing needs to be regulated in a certain way, or that a subsidy would be valuable and it would be effective. So these are the kinds of changes that, there's only a small group of people that you would really want to understand how their thinking is and how their thinking has changed. And that would be something that you wouldn't be recording on a regular basis. You would want to do that through interviews, probably, to capture that information. And so some of the examples that we've done in thematic impact, we did a pre-post study on subjective well-being. This was for a station that was retrofit from being a community standpipe station to having mostly piped connections, about 500 piped connections. And we looked at the impact on how it viewed different aspects of their life. We also did a matching analysis on the impact of solar. So from our regular reporting, we were able to see the difference in electricity expenses on stations that were retrofitted to have solar panels, but we weren't able to see what kind of impact it had on new stations that were built with solar. So the matching analysis allowed us to match those new stations with other stations that had similar characteristics that impacted electricity costs, and compare what the difference is in what they spend on electricity. And we found that it ended up being very similar. So for new stations, it was around 42%. And for retrofitted stations, it was around 41%. And then the customer value and lifetime value analysis was something that started as thematic impact and that we've now worked into our core reporting, also thanks to this new digital platform that just allows us more customization with our reports and dashboards. So here's another example of using this type of reporting, our core data reporting and thematic impact reporting into strategy. So when we were looking at that lifetime and customer value, when we were doing our financial modeling, what we found was that customers who have piped connections purchase 4 times as much water as that of community standpipe customers. And their lifetime value was actually 10 times as much because there's lower attrition rates. So, what this said to us was there were 2 great opportunities here. One was that it led to increased consumption because it was more convenient to get water. People didn't have to walk to a standpipe and carry it back. And so they would be consuming more closer to what the WHO recommends. And then also that it could increase the financial sustainability at stations. And so what we did was we piloted a new model. So this model accommodates over 500 piped connections and is mostly that's the majority of the water we sell. It depends on whether it's a new station, which typically will be all piped connections, or if we retrofit a station, usually there's some customers that want to stay as community standpipe customers, but we'll still end up having somewhere between 300 and 400 piped connections. So we piloted a few of those stations. We had 1 new one and 3 retrofitted ones. And then we did a financial modeling exercise and a scenario modeling exercise last year that showed what kind of impact it would have on our portfolio if we were to scale these types of stations. And we found that it had a massive impact on the ability to cover the long-term sustainability costs, like the field service teams and the asset renewal. And we actually did this as a request of a funder who was the one who funded the pilot and was interested in this kind of work. And they funded part of the scale-up plan. And we were so moved by the findings of this analysis that we actually reframed our whole 5-year strategy in Ghana to focus on these types of stations. And we went to our other core funders with it and also brought them over to support these types of stations. And so it really has shaped now our strategy in Ghana for the next 5 years. And this is, I wanted to show you this, these are some of the charts from the subjective well-being study that we did. So what we did is we asked people before they received a household connection and a few months after on how happy they are with different aspects of their life. So it was quality of family time, the overall health of the family, and then here we have the life as a woman and happiness with their finances. What you can see here is that in the post period, there are much more positive answers of being completely happy or happy but not completely than there are in the neutral or negative answers of unhappy or I am okay. And this was one of the most interesting parts of the study because, you know, again, I think customers' perceptions are really a good indicator of whether or not these types of programs and interventions are actually making people's lives better. So that part of the presentation is really about using the right data and how to optimize the resources that we have based on the role that we have and the advantages we have as implementers and using the right methodology. But then we also want to be able to use this data in a meaningful way. So some of the ways that we can do that is structuring analysis around impact. You know, what were the original problems that we were trying to solve, and what is the impact that we're trying to see? And then also structuring that analysis and outcomes around what our capabilities are and what we have control over. And then finally, also what is salient, what's going to make changes in the sector. So when we look at structuring challenges around impact, you know, I think with any theory of change, before you start a theory of change, you really want to start with what are the market challenges that you're trying to solve through this innovation. So, you know, some of the ones with decentralized water are the high infrastructure costs. It's hard to find local skilled labor who can do preventative maintenance. There's high failure rates because of a lack of maintenance or because of a lack of funds. And this leads to low revenue. Low funding also makes it difficult to fund asset renewal. And then customers, you know, you can't completely rely on revenue for the true cost of water. And sometimes also there can be low information about the value of safe water and also how to store water in a way that will keep it safe. So, you know, one of the ways that we try to address these market failures is building stations, setting up the field service team for to ensure reliability, using innovations that lead to increased uptime or reliability, setting up these mechanisms and doing training for water quality protocols and financial sustainability. But again, you know, when we're trying to do meaningful impact or meaningful analysis, when we talk about expanding access, it's not just about building a station. It's about building a station that's within 30 minutes walking distance of everybody's home, or it's in a community of a certain population size or a certain income demographic where they're not going to be targeted by a national utility or where they're too big for a hand pump. And so these are sort of the things that you want to look at when you're doing analysis is, you know, what are the indicators that are actually going to be good proxies for those changes that we're trying to see. So one example is in India, we have two different models. We have an entrepreneur model and we have the women's self-help group model. So the entrepreneur model generates more revenue on average, and they also have a higher gross operating margin. So they're able to cover, they have more surplus of their revenue left over after covering the local operating expenses. But the women's self-help groups are actually greater contributors to the asset renewal fund. This fund also can go into other capital investments as well. So so this is sort of a question that comes up, and maybe I was thinking of posing it to the group of which do you think is a better indicator for financial sustainability and why? So I'm curious if anyone has an opinion on it.
Anyone have a thought onto that? So the question is the difference between, can you restate the question again? It's
Sure. So, what do we think is a good proxy for financial sustainability in and in decentralized water? Is, the total revenue or the gross operating margin a better proxy, or is it the percentage that these stations that can contribute toward long-term sustainability costs?
I mean, I would guess the latter. That would be my feel.
I would agree. It's hard to say without knowing what the true long-term costs are, but it doesn't seem particularly surprising, right? If the entrepreneur model is centered on the idea of turning a profit, it shouldn't come as a shock that those folks are less inclined to make savings for future capital costs, right? I don't think there's necessarily an assumption that water would be treated different from any other product if you're using an entrepreneurial model.
Right. Yeah. And that brings up an interesting point too, because I think we can all maybe assume from this that in general, this could be saying that the women's self-help groups, are dedicated toward this sustainability, toward giving back to the community. We might be able to infer those kinds of assumptions out of this. So that also says something about, what model is best for this kind of work, right? If it's going to contribute more to that long-term sustainability. And yet, did anyone else have any thoughts on that?
I guess I would just add that with the women's self-help group, I wonder if there's also just the added element of social pressure in a positive way. Mm-hmm. That like if the norm is set up when you set up the group, that we need to be thinking about the long-term sustainability of the project, then several people working together reinforce that for each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And it's the nature of the ownership structure too, right? They're not doing it on their own, they're doing it as a group. So yeah, I would agree with everyone. I also think that the contribution toward long-term sustainability costs is a good measure, and Safe Water Network as an organization looks at it that way too. And going back again to the market failures, it's not that the core issue of decentralized water is not that these stations can't produce revenue or that they can't even cover the local OpEx, because we find that typically it's most stations are able to raise that kind of revenue. It's that they're not able to raise the revenue for the full cost, and then that leads to station failure 5 or 10 years down the line. So this is what factors into our sustainability gap analysis that we do. And this analysis, the first part of it is really capturing the full costs of safe water, safe decentralized water. And this can be trickier than it seems, when we have to look at what's included in the FSC fees and what isn't, what actually is going to be the cost of replacing these parts in 20 years or in 25 years. So this is the sustainability gap analysis of India that we did last year. And this is the analysis that we did for Ghana. And, the purpose of this really serves to quantify those costs and to know also how much money we have to raise to cover that. We presented the Ghana one at a session in November with CWSA, the WASH agency there, and they found it very helpful to be able to quantify those costs. And so these are kind of the building blocks that are needed to eventually get to a point of having a government subsidy or having some other kind of investment into this area. So another point that I brought up was that creating meaningful impact is also about thinking about what you have control over and what you can have and what your role is as an implementer. So right now, as I mentioned, we're talking about how we want to measure indirect impact. One of our key impact metrics was population of access, and we wanted to expand this to our technical advisory and our sector engagement work. Although there was some disagreement internally that people did not want to say our policy advisory work was leading to increasing access for this many people, because we're not the ones who are implementing the policy, and it wasn't right and it wasn't standard in the sector to be taking credit for that. And so we looked at, what others in the sector were doing, and we also looked at, again, what we think are proxies for creating an enabling environment or fostering collaboration. And this came down to the number of evidence-based reports that we put out, the number of meetings that we have with alliance groups, and the number of members within the alliance group also that we have. And this is something that we now use to measure indirect impact. And yeah, I wanted to pose this question as well, whether you think that we can attribute expanding access to those kinds of activities, and then also if you think that there are other proxies that make sense for that kind of indirect impact.
Does anyone have any thoughts? Alex, maybe? It's tough.
Yeah, it is tough. And we, one thing too, I had mentioned it before, but it's part of this whole discussion, and it's something that we actually talked to Katie into 60 decibels about, because they admitted, they said, looking at policy changes is not in our wheelhouse, although they are also starting to develop some expertise in that. And, Katie was one of the ones who said, we could take that same approach to this customer-centric data of learning about how opinions change, but just focus it on those stakeholders and those decision makers that we're trying to, that we're working with on that level. And so that's one way that we're considering capturing impact, is to be doing maybe interviews every couple of years, trying to capture what people's opinions are and what's needed to make a change. And then the last thing is that so this data, as I mentioned, impact evaluation can be used to access financing. We in 2020, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the government of Ghana issued a free water mandate. So implementers were required to provide free water during that time, and then it would be repaid later on. So we right now, based on what we have requested in repayment, have received almost 50% of that back from CWSA. And this is significantly more than other implementers in Ghana. One of the reasons that we were able to recoup that much is because we do have such robust core reporting. So we have all the data on our finances, we have all the data on our volumes, and all of the backup of the review process as well. And down the line, in any situation where there is a government subsidy, it's going to be a similar requirement to have to submit a lot of data to be getting that money back. So definitely, investing in that core reporting is something that is going to be necessary for government subsidies. We've also experimented with loans, and this was a very long time ago at Safe Water Network when we first started building stations. And at the time, we definitely overestimated the amount of surplus revenue that we would have left over. This was before we had done all of this analysis to quantify the true costs of delivering water. And as a result, we had a loan that we could not afford. So one of the things that I did when I started at Safe Water Network was to restructure that loan with the lender and change the terms. And one of the things that allowed this second phase to be successful, because we've met all the payments so far, is that we had this, again, robust financial data. So we knew we could project pretty well what kind of money we would be making and what kind of loan payments we could afford based on that. And it was, of course, significantly lower. We had cut the principal by 50%. We cut the interest rate from 10 to 2%. And we made the payments based on cash flow. So after sustainability costs are met, 65% of that revenue goes toward paying off this loan. And then right now we're also in discussions for a results-based financing mechanism. And again, the impact reporting and evaluation was one of the reasons why this funder was interested in us, because the payments are going to be based on volumetric data and on uptime. So being able to supply that and having the review process is something that's very important in getting any kind of results-based payment. And I wanted to say one of my favorite examples of using impact evaluation to catalyze funding, and that also highlights the importance of using indicators that are salient, is the deworming RCT that was done in Kenya with evidence action. One of the reasons that became such a famous RCT is because in the past, all of the deworming RCTs related to health, whereas they related it to school absenteeism, which was one of the indicators that the government of Kenya was evaluating their own performance on. So when they could show that the deworming program had an impact on absenteeism, they then were able to get the government of Kenya to invest in these programs and scale it across the country. So it's another thing to consider is, when you're doing analysis, what is the purpose of it? And if the purpose is to catalyze funding, what are the indicators that governments care about? What are the indicators that private lenders care about and that donors care about? Because that's definitely going to get you, the most out of that analysis. So lastly, I wanted to give you an overview of this work that we've been doing with other SWEs around social impact measurement. So we did a survey in the spring of 2021, and we did it with 11 other implementers. Here's a list of the implementers that we were working with. And the objectives of the survey were to understand how small water enterprises were evaluating social impact. We wanted to know the challenges of measuring social impact, and then also what implementers wanted funders to know about measuring social impact. So one of the things that was most interesting about this survey was that the challenges and what implementers wanted funders to know, there was a lot of alignment on that. But when we asked them what indicators they use to measure social impact, there was not a lot of overlap between what implementers use. So across the 11 organizations, there were 34 indicators that were listed, and this was not even an exhausted list. This was sort of a top line list that people gave, and only 8 of those indicators overlapped. So 76% of the indicators people use for social impact were unique to that implementer. And another thing that we thought was interesting that came out of this was that 3 of the implementers also highlighted the importance of using user feedback. So that's something we've talked about, right, is that it's not just important to be getting these hard numbers, but also the feedback from the customers is a really important part of that evaluation. And another thing that was interesting to Safe Water Network was that a few of these implementers also said water quality was a social impact indicator, which we measured, but it wasn't something that we would have grouped into social impact, although it makes sense, right? Because it's one of the best proxies for how it's going to improve health. So that also just goes to show that the way that we were defining and looking at social impact in the sector is also very different across implementers. So here we just try to group them into different categories, and these categories do overlap. But it can show you that, I think when it comes to these looking at other areas of impact, whether it's community trust or health and education, we tend to have a lot more types of indicators because there's a lot more uncertainty around that. And so people are choosing different things. And there are a lot of different proxies that you can use to look at that. Whereas something like access, for instance, number of stations, number of connections, these are all pretty standard across different implementers.
What's the number, Lauren? 8873?
Oh, so this was of the 34 indicators, we mapped them into these different categories. But they do overlap, as I said. Yeah. And so then we also asked about methodologies that people use. We asked between, the standard financial and performance reporting, so that's the core impact reporting, field surveys, which could be done either self-paced, where you give a tablet device to a community member and then they pass it on to someone else, or you can have personnel go in with a tablet and take down answers, or go in with a pen and paper and then record answers later. You can also have an outside auditor, and then water quality testing we included because some people saw it as social impact reporting. So here you can see 7 of the implementers consider their core impact reporting to be part of their social impact reporting. 8 use surveys to capture this information, 1 used an outside auditor, and 4 of them use water quality testing to capture this data. These questions were about frequency. So we have the first chart shows the minimum time frame that implementers are collecting social impact indicators. So 1 is at least daily, the majority is at least 5, at least monthly, some annually. And then there was 1 social entrepreneur who said they don't collect social impact data. And then many implementers also report at multiple points during the year, and the most report on a monthly basis. So we asked implementers what they saw as the challenges to collecting social impact data. And we mapped these out on 2 different scales. So 1 is internal validity, things that affect the ability to draw conclusions from the study itself, and then external validity, which are challenges to replicating it or drawing conclusions about other contexts. And then the second scale is rigid to flexible. So rigid would be challenges that are difficult to solve or out of our control to solve, and flexible would be problems that we can solve if we have the right resources. And then some of these are also different sizes. That's the larger they are, the more often it was mentioned by different implementers. So, one of the big ones, again, goes back to this issue of causation and an expectation to show causation, which we've talked about, is really not something that it makes sense for an implementer to be spending their resources on. It also, even with doing smaller surveys, requires a lot of time and resources. It requires training. And so, oftentimes there's there's the desire to get this data from funders, but not always the desire to fund it, or to fund it as much as what's needed. Some other ones, identifying the right indicators that you can either attribute to the intervention or that are good proxies that demonstrate impact. The availability of baseline data can also be a challenge. Lots of the communities, they might have seasonal migration or move for work or school, so it's difficult to get a representative sample. Sometimes we have to rely on the entrepreneurs or the field team to get answers, so there's more distance between the people doing the analysis and the people who are getting the information. Digital tools, as we said, can be a real asset, but they can also cause problems if they're not working correctly or we don't have the right training. And then it can be difficult, even when you do have these findings, to apply it to other contexts. And the second question was, what do you want funders to know? So again, there was a lot of overlap here. One of the big ones is that it just takes a lot of time and a lot of resources to be doing these projects, and that funders should not only want to cover the cost of the evaluation, but also the baseline data, the post-intervention data, and even ongoing M&E to see how this data is changing after the intervention is implemented. Another issue is that it takes a lot of time to see behavior change. So grant timelines don't necessarily take place over the time that you want to see, people start to change their behavior around water or how they're saving or contributing to different funds. Also the scope that, if we do impact evaluations, it shouldn't be systematic on everything: work, health, education. It should really be focused in one area. And then again, expectations, right? Because a lot of what we do, we're piloting new programs, there's a lot of risks and unknowns. And so not only should they not expect us to show causations, but there's going to be a lot of iteration along the way. And then again, that not all social impact is quantitative, and that user feedback can be really important. So what we did after this work is we set up a partnership with 60 Decibels. For those of you who don't know, they specialize in lean data impact evaluation. They started at Acumen. One of the reasons they started was because they did not want to be putting too many resources into social impact evaluation. They wanted the money to go toward the actual implementation and the program. And so they wanted to find a way to do this in a way that would capture really good data, but that also wasn't so resource heavy. And so they spun off that lean data into 60 Decibels, and it seemed like a right fit for what we were looking for and what they could provide. So we're now doing 2 workshops with them, and we're also going to do a series of working group roundtables. So one of the workshops is on impact measurement and methodologies. This was something that follow-up interviews after this survey showed that implementers were really interested in learning more about more tools that they can use, especially ones that were right for a nonprofit or a social enterprise. And then the other was on impact alignment, because that was one of the major things that came out of this study. And then as a result of these workshops, we're going to receive a lean data survey tool that all the implementers will be able to use and customize for their own needs. And then we would like to do a next phase where we actually test out this lean data survey at a few implementers and see what comes out of that. So, we'll definitely, now Green Empowerment is attending those workshops, so we'll definitely keep you updated on how that progresses.
Thank you so much for inviting us.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I mean, the more implementers, the better, right? Because that's one of the whole points. So yeah, thank you for joining. So yeah, I'll leave it now to some questions if anybody has questions on the presentation. I think I used too much time.
No, not at all. Thank you so much for the presentation. Some people texted me that they had something else going on, so they had to step out. But yeah, good thing we've recorded it. So I don't know, any questions, comments? I have a few questions. I want to jump in.
Hi, thanks, Lauren, for sharing this knowledge and for your presentation. I have two questions. First is that, is the government involved in these kind of projects? I mean, is it a stakeholder? And if it is, then what kind of support does it lend, especially in the work that goes on in India? And the second question is, could you please share some details on these remote monitoring tools that these projects use for their monitoring and evaluation works?
Yeah, I can definitely share some more information on what you're interested specifically in India, what they're using. Yeah, I can share more information on the tools that we use. If you wanna, I can get your email from Joaquim and send you some of the information we have on that.
All right, thanks.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And then as far as the government being involved, I wouldn't say that they're involved. They're not funding the evaluations. We do get support from local assemblies in India to help fund the field service capability there. And so some of that does go into that data collection and review. So we do get some report there. And then I would say, it's more about going back to those salient issues of, based on our conversations with the government, we've done trainings with them, we've done policy advisory, how do we best sort of communicate this data to what they're looking for.
So eventually it has to be submitted to them for any approval, or?
No, yeah, we don't have to submit any data to the government.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
And just last question. The communities that these projects are installed in, these are rural communities or communities within the city, like as in they are based on the outskirts of the city, or totally rural communities?
They're peri-urban, so in between a city and a rural area. We targeted those areas because they're too large for hand pumps, but too small for utilities. So typically they're like between 3,000 and 5,000 people.
Okay.
Yeah, and in India, most of our stations are close to Delhi. They're in Telangana and Maharashtra.
Yeah. Okay, all right. Thank you so much. I was particularly interested in knowing the scenario in India because I'm originally from India, and I know water is a big issue there.
Yeah.
So, all right. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Of course.
Yeah. I had a question now that conversation was about who pays for these studies. How do you typically, so how much do they typically cost you guys to do impact? And then is this included like on the grant, or how do you typically fund these?
We haven't really quantified that, and I think it would be a good exercise to do that. Usually, so I have, my role in the New York office is in this analytics and program side. And then I have counterparts in Ghana and India who have the same roles. And whenever we're taking on these additional analyses, whether it's something thematic that we want to do ourselves or the core reporting, it's kind of just built into our regular salaries and benefits and things like that. So, I mean, I feel like you could even probably take at least 70 to 80% of what all of those salaries are, in some cases 100%. And then, when we do grants and they do ask for a specific analysis or a publication, we'll usually look at what are the typical hours to do something like that. And, and that's what we'll put in the budget. But it definitely is something that, if you have the in-house capability to do it, you don't necessarily have to spend more money to do it as long as your staff isn't overburdened. When we look at using outside help for that, 60 decibels to do their lean data survey is about 20,000 per country, which I think is fairly reasonable. When we hire, we've also hired local organizations in Ghana and India to do surveys in our community, and those will also range between about 5 and 15,000.
Were you going to ask a question?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah,
Yeah, thanks, Lauren, for the interesting presentation. You mentioned the fact about timing, because usually donor grants run usually at a minimum of year scale. So I was just interested to know how long your pilot projects usually run for you to have so much impact data in. I'm just really wondering how long your projects usually run for you to see to have such impact generally.
Mm-hmm. We like to have a minimum of a year. And one of the reasons that we do that is because a lot of our focus is around financial sustainability and purchasing behavior and consumption. And because of seasonality, if you do a pilot in Q1, it's not going to perform the same way it does in Q3. So we really try to insist on a year. I mean, we've had funders, who've wanted to get an analysis before that. And so we'll do it sometimes and just say, there are limitations to this study or there's caveats that we should include, but we like to say a minimum of a year. And I mean, it depends too on, we do find, that now we've sort of got a system in place that when we talk about the behavior change of community buy-in or recognizing the value of water, a year is enough time to start to see those changes, certainly. So I think that that's what we would stick to.
Yeah, thanks.
Any other questions?
Hi, Lauren. Yeah, I have another question. Oh, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yeah.
Sorry, my connection might be kind of bad, but I think I just had a question more so about how you're using this data maybe across the regions. Like, it seems like the methodology is very specific to maybe a project in a certain region. Can you speak a little bit more to how you use, like if you're doing any cross analysis amongst that data within like maybe India comparatively to Ghana or Kenya, that kind of piece of it?
Yeah, so I think that whenever we approach an analysis in this way, I would say the first step is that you're almost doing it backwards, right? So rather than looking at the core reporting and trying to draw conclusions from that, you would want to start with interviews from people on the ground to understand how they're measuring things, why, what are the nuances in that context and how they compare to others. So you definitely want to have a lot of that discussion to try to understand what are going to be the limitations of doing that kind of analysis, or what things should be included and what we should look out for. And it is very difficult to do those kinds of cross-country analysis. And you want to be careful too, because you don't want to say something that works in Ghana is going to work in Indonesia, and without first understanding the context of that. So I would really say, it would have to start with those discussions. And then, if you're able to get buy-in to a specific framework, to what kind of metrics and data you'll be using, then, then you could go forward with the analysis. And then again, I would always include, especially if it's an external publication, I would always make sure you include those limitations of the study too.
Right, because are the core impact measurements that you guys are, that you're measuring, I assume that those are feeding into the thematic, sorry, I think my connection, the thematic impacts that you're measuring. So maybe my question is more so how the core data from each country deep into that thematic stuff, because I guess for me, I deal a lot with the grants also, and I feel like the thematic piece is what a lot of the times funders want to hear with some of that core data sprinkled in, right? So I think I'm just a little bit more interested in that piece of it.
You mean how to use that data in thematic impact analysis? Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
So yeah, let me think of an example. Okay, so with the matching analysis that we did, for example, some of our core data, it shows us, which stations have solar panels, what the installation date is, what the electricity charges are, what the volumes are, the population size. So when we decided to do a matching analysis, we needed to take the stations that were newly built with solar, and then we needed to find matches for them to compare. So the sort of additional thematic part of that was, okay, what characteristics are we going to have that are going to impact electricity costs? So how are we going to match these? And then, another one is that data on electricity going to be accurate, which it not always is, because sometimes electricity companies will charge you in 1 month for electricity that happens a few months ago once they're able to reevaluate their data. And so we even had to go back and look at what the electricity usage was for those months and those stations, and what the price per kilowatt per hour was based on the bills that we were getting from the electricity company. So we had to go back and clean up that data. We had to do the analysis of coming up of what are going to be the characteristics that we capture data on that we can use to compare and to match these stations. And then doing the actual matching analysis was something that, was out of our core reporting. So I would say still, a lot of the time we try to use as much of that data as we can, but often we do end up needing more types of data from that. But if we can use it, then we use it.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Seems like people are stepping out. They probably have things going on. I did have maybe last one question about this results-based finance, Lauren, if you want to share a little bit more about how that's going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we've been working with Uptime Catalyst. They're part of Oxford. They're related to Oxford. And so they're looking at doing a results-based financing. The purpose of it is to fund field service. So the payments will be based on operations that we already do, either building stations or selling water. And then, reaching a certain point, we get payment based on that. And the payment can really go into anything. So in some ways, it's kind of like unrestricted funding, but generally, that's where we need the unrestricted funding, is for these long-term sustainability costs, because it's not that common to be able to get it in a grant. So right now we have done some sort of preliminary analysis looking at what our past data looks like on these types of things that they're measuring, whether it's uptime or volume, and how much would the payment have been based on that historical data. And then, we've done some site visits as well. They've looked at our technology. They've looked at how we collect data, how we review it. And then the next phase is really going to be projecting forward, what do we think payments would be for next year if we were to use this kind of mechanism, and then getting funding for it, and then actually signing contracts to start the funding mechanism. And this is something, all of these things are so intertwined, because a funding mechanism like this can also drive that alignment and benchmarking among implementers too. If everyone is reporting in the same way, because this is how they get funding, then that opens up opportunities also for evaluation.
Very interesting. So, I mean, we think we've passed a little bit of time. I don't know if there's any burning question, anyone?
Maybe one last question as we
Go ahead.
close. Yes, so I know earlier you talked about the water ATMs, and here in Uganda, Lauren, many organizations are piloting them. So one thing that I see as a challenge for one organization that I'd worked with earlier, Water for People, was around the local supply chain for some of these parts for the ATM. So I'm just wondering how you guys work around it in India and Ghana. I don't know whether it's a challenge you've faced, because mostly you find that there was high demand for these ATMs, specifically in peri-urban areas, but then because they had to import some of these parts from China or from the US, there was that gap in demand. So people never really had water. So there was just that challenge around that. So I don't know whether you've faced that where you've piloted these.
Mm-hmm. We did, and supply chain issues are, getting worse, but it was already difficult even in the beginning because a lot of the parts had to be shipped. It would take a long time. There weren't necessarily people within the country even who had, the knowledge of how to fix these machines. And so sometimes it would have to be someone from the company who created it would have to fly over and look at them to fix them. So, one of the things we've done is local training on how to maintenance those parts and fix those parts. And that's reduced our need to replace anything as well. The supply, keeping spare parts is an interesting discussion topic. We ran into this issue in the lockdown where we ran out of parts that we needed for stations. And one of the solutions to that is to stockpile more of these parts, but stockpiling parts is not necessarily a good business decision. It's a big liability. It's a big expense, and there's a lot of depreciation there. So I think it's a very tricky area to be in. I would go back to, with these ATM machines, they are very expensive and the maintenance for them is very expensive. And so I think in our analysis, and this is really like an ongoing process, is to capture those full costs. So based on your experience, you may find that the cost of an ATM is not just the initial hardware, but it's also all of the parts that need replacing. It's all of the, maintenance bills or trips that the technology vendor has to do. And then that will kind of inform, whether or not it's the right technology for these stations. We've at existing stations, we've stopped installing ATMs. We do prepaid meters now because it's 1/10 of the price. And it serves the same purpose in terms of increasing collection efficiencies. And in some ways it causes less problems because you only have to train the vendors on how to use mobile money and not the customers. So sometimes it's, with these technologies, I feel like we all want to buy into it and think, this is going to make a big difference, or this is the way to go. But it's not necessarily, it doesn't always necessarily make sense financially, which doesn't mean we shouldn't always use it. I think if it makes sense on a social impact level, then we should still use it. We did another analysis around solar, around whether or not it actually increases financial sustainability, and it doesn't. I mean, even with lowering electricity costs, solar panels are so expensive and they need to be replaced so often that we don't save money by using solar, but we still believe that it's the right way to go because solar ensures that we have consistent power and access to water all day long. And that's invaluable, when it comes to building trust and when it comes to providing service to our customers. So financial is not the only metric that you want to look at about whether or not a technology works, but it's definitely something that's come up when we've looked at water ATMs.
Yeah, and I think you really mentioned a very important point, because most of the organizations I've interacted with, they're doing ATMs really targeting the financial side of things and not really looking at social impact. So I think, yeah, you have some very interesting points there. Yeah, thanks.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Lauren, again, for taking the time to present to us. We'll be sharing this recording in our next newsletter, which will have another session a month from now. We're having a nonprofit in, I don't know if they're a nonprofit, yeah, EOS International. They are based in Honduras and Nicaragua, and they do this circuit rider program, technical assistance to many of these projects that they sort of support. And so we'll have a talk with them about their program. So if you want to join, it's going to be in Spanish, but we'll do the same, record and share. So
Okay, great. Well, unfortunately I don't speak Spanish, but otherwise I would join.
we'll try to do we're going to try to do like a one-pager summary. So
Okay, great. Yeah.
In both Spanish and English. But thank you again so much for taking the time, and thanks everyone for joining. Yeah, we'll be sharing the presentation later.
Yeah, thank you everyone. It was great to meet you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.